The social worker's clipboard trembled slightly in her hands as she avoided my eyes. "Mrs. Thompson, your family has completed all the paperwork for your admission to Willowbrook Assisted Living. The van will be here in 30 minutes to transport you. I'm sorry, but they've specified that you should pack only essential personal items. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." I sat in my favorite armchair, the one Harold had bought me for our 40th anniversary, watching this young woman deliver what my own children thought would be devastating news. Around me, the house on Maple Street held 78 years of memories, 45 years of marriage, and until this morning, what my family believed was $3 million in assets they were eager to inherit. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, being forced out of my own home on Thanksgiving Day, while across town, the staff at St. Catherine's Soup Kitchen was probably wondering why their biggest benefactor hadn't shown up to help serve dinner to the homeless. They had no idea that just 72 hours ago, I had quietly signed over the deed to this house, along with every stock, bond, and bank account I owned, to the St. Catherine's Community Foundation. "Margaret," the social worker continued, her voice softer now. "I know this is difficult, but your son Daniel explained that you've been having episodes of confusion, forgetting to pay bills, leaving the stove on. He's genuinely concerned about your safety living alone." I couldn't help but smile at that. Daniel, concerned about my safety. The same Daniel who hadn't visited me in 8 months until he heard from his siblings that I might be changing my will. The same Daniel who had spent the last 3 weeks calling daily, not to check on my health, but to subtly probe about my financial plans and suggest I should consolidate my assets for easier management. The episodes of confusion he mentioned were carefully orchestrated performances on my part, designed to make my children believe exactly what they wanted to believe: that their mother was becoming a helpless old woman who could be easily manipulated. What they didn't know was that every supposed senior moment had been witnessed by Helen Crawford, my sharp-eyed neighbor, who had been documenting their visits and recording their conversations at my request. You see, I've always been good with numbers. Had to be, working as Harold's bookkeeper for 30 years while he built Thompson Construction from a one-man operation into the most successful contracting business in Riverside County. After he passed 5 years ago, I took over managing our investments completely, turning our comfortable nest egg into something substantial through careful planning and shrewd decisions. My children assumed I was too grief-stricken and overwhelmed to handle financial matters, but the truth was, I had never been more focused. The first sign of trouble came 18 months ago when Jessica, my only daughter, started visiting more frequently. At first, I was delighted. Jessica had always been the busiest of my 3 children, juggling her real estate career with raising 2 teenagers. Her sudden interest in spending time with me felt like a gift, until I realized her visits always included subtle suggestions about how I should simplify my life. "Mother," she would say, perching on the edge of my couch like a bird ready to take flight, "this house is so much work for you to maintain. Have you considered downsizing? There are some lovely senior communities where you wouldn't have to worry about yard work or repairs." I would nod and make non-committal sounds while internally noting how her eyes scanned the room, calculating values, cataloging antiques. Then came Kevin, my youngest, with his own brand of concern. "Mom," he would begin, settling into Harold's old recliner with the familiarity of someone staking a claim, "I've been thinking about your future security. With inflation and market volatility, maybe you should consider putting your assets into a family trust, to protect them from potential healthcare costs or legal issues." Kevin worked as a financial advisor, so his suggestions carried the weight of professional expertise, even though I knew his own finances were stretched thin from his recent divorce and expensive lifestyle. Daniel's approach was the most direct, probably because as the eldest, he felt entitled to take charge. During one particularly memorable visit, he brought his wife Stephanie and a folder full of brochures for assisted living facilities. "Dad wouldn't want you struggling alone," he announced, spreading glossy pamphlets across my kitchen table. "These places offer so much: activities, healthcare, social interaction, and the financial benefits are significant. You could sell this house, use the proceeds to pay for care, and still have plenty left over for your estate." That phrase, "left over for your estate," revealed everything I needed to know about their motivations. They weren't concerned about my well-being or happiness. They were concerned about preserving their inheritance while removing the inconvenience of caring for an aging parent. The breaking point came 3 months ago, during what was supposed to be a pleasant family dinner. I had invited all 3 children and their families to celebrate Kevin's birthday, spending the day preparing his favorite meal and baking the chocolate cake he had loved since childhood. The house was filled with the sounds I cherished most: grandchildren laughing, conversation flowing, multiple generations gathered around the dining room table Harold had handcrafted 40 years earlier. But as the evening progressed, I noticed the adults whispering among themselves, shooting meaningful glances in my direction. Finally, after the grandchildren had gone to the living room to watch a movie, Jessica cleared her throat and announced they had something important to discuss with me. "Mother," she began, using the tone she reserved for difficult real estate clients, "we've been talking, and we're all worried about you living alone in this big house." I started to protest, but Daniel held up his hand to silence me, a gesture that sent a flash of anger through me that I carefully concealed. "We've found the perfect solution," he continued, producing another brochure with a flourish. "Willowbrook Assisted Living is the premier facility in the area. Private apartments, gourmet dining, full medical support, and a wonderful social program. You'd love it there, Mom." Kevin jumped in, his financial advisor persona fully activated. "And here's the best part. We can handle all the transition details for you. Sell the house, transfer your accounts to a more suitable structure, take care of all the paperwork. You won't have to worry about anything." Stephanie, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. "We could even arrange for someone to come pack your personal items. You know, help you decide what's really worth keeping." The way she said it, with that slight emphasis on really worth keeping, made it clear that my lifetime of treasures would be evaluated through the lens of their convenience, not my sentiment. I sat there, surrounded by my children and their spouses, realizing that they were discussing my life as if I were already incompetent, as if my opinions and desires were irrelevant obstacles to their plans. They had it all figured out. Remove me from my home, control my assets, and present it as loving care rather than financial opportunism. That night, after they had all gone home with promises to start looking into the details, I sat in my quiet house and made a decision that would change everything. If they wanted to treat me like a helpless old woman, I would give them exactly what they expected, while quietly taking steps to ensure they would never profit from their callous calculation. The next morning, I called Samuel Porter, the attorney, who had handled Harold's estate. Samuel had known our family for 20 years and had always treated me with the respect and consideration my own children seemed incapable of showing. When I explained what I wanted to do, he was initially hesitant. "Maggie," he said, using the nickname only close friends were allowed, "are you certain about this? It's a significant decision that can't easily be reversed." I assured him that I had never been more certain of anything in my life. The papers were drawn up within a week, and I spent the following months carefully orchestrating what would become the most satisfying performance of my 78 years. I began leaving bills unpaid, not out of confusion, but as evidence of my supposed decline. I started small, letting the newspaper subscription lapse, forgetting to pay the gardener, allowing minor household repairs to pile up. When my children visited, they found exactly what they were looking for: proof that I could no longer manage my affairs. I also began making carefully scripted phone calls to each of them, conversations designed to reinforce their belief that I was becoming forgetful and vulnerable. I would call Jessica to ask about a grandchild's birthday that had already passed, or phone Kevin to express confusion about a bank statement I understood perfectly well. With Daniel, I played up concerns about the house's maintenance, mentioning problems that were either exaggerated or entirely fictional. The most challenging part was maintaining the facade during their increasingly frequent visits. They came separately now, each trying to position themselves as my primary caregiver and financial advisor. Jessica brought restaurant meals and offered to take over my bill paying. Kevin arrived with investment reports and suggestions for simplifying my portfolio. Daniel showed up with contractors to evaluate repairs that I had told him were needed, repairs that were actually unnecessary, but that I allowed him to arrange, adding to the impression that I was overwhelmed by homeownership. Through it all, Helen Crawford was my secret ally and witness. Helen had been my neighbor for 23 years, and she was one of the few people who knew the real me, not the confused elderly woman my children saw during their visits. She had watched Harold and me build our life together, had seen me handle his business affairs after his death, and she understood exactly what my children were trying to do. Helen's house sat close enough to mine that she could observe the comings and goings next door, and her guest bedroom window provided a perfect vantage point for watching my children's behavior when they thought no one was looking. More importantly, Helen had helped me install a discreet recording system that captured every conversation in my living room, dining room, and kitchen. The recordings revealed the truth about my family's motivations with startling clarity. During one visit, when they thought I was napping upstairs, I heard Jessica tell her brothers, "We need to move faster on this. Mom's getting worse, and if she keeps making financial mistakes, there won't be much left to inherit." Kevin agreed, adding, "The longer we wait, the more complicated it becomes. We should get power of attorney established as soon as possible." Daniel, ever the practical one, suggested they divide responsibilities to speed up the process. "I'll handle the house sale and coordinate with the assisted living facility," he announced. "Jessica, you work on getting her medical evaluation completed. Kevin, start consolidating her accounts and investments. We need to present this as a unified plan so she doesn't feel like we're ganging up on her." The medical evaluation he mentioned was particularly insulting. They had arranged for me to see a geriatric specialist, not because they were concerned about my health, but because they needed professional documentation of my supposed cognitive decline. The appointment was scheduled for the week before Thanksgiving, perfectly timed to provide the final piece of evidence they needed to justify their actions. Dr. Hayes, my longtime family physician, had actually warned me about their plan. He had known me for 15 years and had no doubt about my mental acuity, but he explained that geriatric evaluations could be subjective, especially when family members provided particular narratives about concerning behaviors. He suggested, I consider what I wanted the outcome to be, a hint that he understood more about the situation than my children realized. I decided to give them exactly the evaluation they wanted. During the appointment, I played up confusion about dates and times, claimed to forget conversations that had never happened, and expressed anxiety about managing daily tasks. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The geriatrician, Dr. Patricia Williams, was thorough and professional, but she was also working with information provided by my children about my supposed decline. Her report, which I received a copy of through Samuel Porter's legal channels, recommended supervised living arrangements and assistance with financial management. It was exactly what Daniel, Jessica, and Kevin needed to proceed with their plan, and they moved quickly to make arrangements. The call came on Thanksgiving morning. I was preparing to leave for St. Catharines, where I had volunteered to help serve dinner to the community's less fortunate families, when Daniel phoned to inform me that they were all coming over for an important family meeting. His tone brooked no argument, and he made it clear that this was not a request. They arrived within an hour, but not for the Thanksgiving dinner I might have expected. Instead, they came with paperwork, moving boxes, and the social worker who was now sitting in my living room, waiting for the van that would transport me to Willowbrook Assisted Living. The social worker, whose name was Margaret, ironically the same as mine, was clearly uncomfortable with the situation. She kept glancing around the house, taking in the family photos, the well-maintained furniture, the obvious signs of a life lived, fully and independently. I could see the doubt in her eyes, the professional instinct that something about this placement didn't feel right. "Mrs. Thompson," she said hesitantly, "do you understand what's happening today? Are you comfortable with this arrangement?" Before I could answer, Daniel stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority he believed his position as eldest son granted him. "Mom gets confused sometimes," he explained, using the patient tone people employ when discussing someone they believe can't understand. "The doctor's evaluation showed clear signs of cognitive decline, and we've been finding evidence of financial mismanagement. Bills going unpaid, important documents misplaced, that sort of thing. This placement is for her own safety and well-being." Jessica nodded supportively, adding, "We've tried to help her stay at home, but it's become too much for her to handle. She needs professional care and supervision." Kevin, standing slightly apart from his siblings, seemed less comfortable with the deception, but he didn't contradict their version of events. The social worker made notes on her clipboard, but I could see she was troubled by something she couldn't quite identify. Perhaps it was the way I was sitting calmly in my chair, showing none of the agitation or confusion she might expect from someone experiencing cognitive decline. Maybe it was the pristine condition of the house, which didn't match the narrative of someone unable to maintain their living situation. "Mrs. Thompson," she addressed me directly, "do you have any questions about Willowbrook? Have you had a chance to visit the facility?" I smiled at her, the same serene smile I had been practicing for months, and shook my head gently. "I trust my children's judgment," I replied, allowing just a hint of resignation to color my voice. "They know what's best for me." The words tasted bitter, but they served their purpose. The social worker made another note, clearly torn between her professional protocols and her personal instincts. Daniel checked his watch impatiently. "The van should be here any minute," he announced. "Mom, we've packed a suitcase with your essentials, and we'll bring more of your personal items once you're settled." I nodded obediently, playing my part perfectly, while internally savoring the irony of his concern for my personal items. That's when I decided it was time to reveal the truth. Standing slowly from my chair, using the careful movements they expected from a frail, elderly woman, I walked to the antique secretary desk, where Harold used to pay bills. From the bottom drawer, I withdrew a leather portfolio that contained copies of all the documents Samuel Porter had prepared for me. "I have something to share with all of you," I announced, my voice carrying a strength that made everyone in the room look up sharply. "Since you're so concerned about my financial management and my ability to make appropriate decisions about my future, I thought you should know what I've done with my estate." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as I opened the portfolio and began distributing copies of legal documents. Daniel reached for his copy first, his eyes scanning the pages with growing alarm. Jessica grabbed hers next, her real estate experience helping her understand the implications immediately. Kevin took his more slowly, but his financial background meant he grasped the situation just as quickly. "These documents show that 3 days ago, I transferred ownership of this house, along with all of my bank accounts, investment portfolios, and personal assets, to the St. Catherine's Community Foundation," I explained, watching their faces cycle through disbelief, shock, and finally, rage. "The total value of the donation is approximately $8 million, which will be used to fund the church's soup kitchen, homeless shelter, and community outreach programs." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the social worker stopped, writing, her pen frozen above her clipboard as she tried to process what she had just heard. Daniel was the first to find his voice, but what came out was barely recognizable as speech. "You can't," he sputtered, his face flushing red with anger. "And disbelief? You don't have the authority. You're not competent to make decisions like this. The doctor's report clearly states that you need supervision for financial matters." I smiled at him, and for the first time in months, it was my genuine smile, not the confused, placating expression I had been wearing like a mask. "Actually, Daniel, the timing of that medical evaluation is quite interesting. You see, I made these transfers 3 days before my appointment with Dr. Williams, while I was still legally competent to manage my own affairs. The evaluation that you arranged to justify this placement actually has no bearing on decisions I made prior to that date." Jessica stood up abruptly, her professional composure cracking. "This is elder abuse," she declared, pointing at me as if I were a stranger rather than the woman who had raised her. "Someone influenced you to do this, manipulated you into signing away our inheritance. We'll contest this. We'll prove you weren't competent when you signed those papers." I walked to the window, looking out at the house where Helen Crawford was, undoubtedly watching this scene unfold, and gestured for my neighbor to join us. Helen appeared at my front door within minutes, carrying a small recording device and a thick folder of documents. "I'd like you all to meet the witness to your months of planning," I said as Helen entered the living room. "Helen has been documenting your visits, recording your conversations, and photographing your behavior when you thought no one was watching. She has been my eyes and ears, helping me understand exactly what you were planning to do with my life and my assets." Helen, bless her heart, had never looked more satisfied. She set the recording device on my coffee table and opened her folder, revealing dozens of photographs and detailed notes about each of my children's visits. "Margaret asked me to help her document what was really happening here," she explained. To the room, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 40 years as a high school principal. "These recordings will show that Mrs. Thompson has been completely lucid and competent throughout this entire period. Her supposed confusion and forgetfulness were performances designed to reveal your true motivations for wanting to control her life and assets." The social worker, who had been watching this drama unfold with growing amazement, finally spoke up. "Mrs. Thompson, are you saying that you've been pretending to have cognitive issues? That your family's concerns about your capacity were unfounded?" I returned to my chair, sitting with the straight posture and alert expression that had been mine all along. "Margaret, that's exactly what I'm saying. I've been testing my children's character, and I'm afraid they've failed spectacularly. Rather than offering genuine care and support, they've spent months plotting to separate me from my home and my independence so they could inherit my assets more conveniently." Kevin, who had been silent throughout this revelation, finally spoke up. "Mom, we were trying to help you. We thought you needed care and supervision." His voice lacked conviction, and he couldn't meet my eyes as he spoke. "Were you trying to help?" "Me, Kevin?" I asked gently. "Or were you trying to help yourselves? Because according to these recordings, your primary concern has been preserving your inheritance, not ensuring my well-being. You've spent more time calculating the value of this house than you have asking about my happiness or my wishes for my future." The van from Willowbrook Assisted Living chose that moment to arrive, its driver honking to announce his presence. The social worker looked around the room, clearly recognizing that the situation had changed dramatically from what she had been told to expect. "Mrs. Thompson," she said carefully, "given what I've just learned, I don't believe this placement is appropriate. You appear to be fully competent to make your own decisions about your living situation and your assets. I'm going to have to cancel this admission and file a report about the circumstances that led to this referral." Daniel's composure finally cracked completely. "You vindictive old woman," he shouted, his face now purple with rage. "You've destroyed our family over what? Some petty revenge because we wanted to make sure you were safe. That money was our inheritance, our future security, and you've given it away to strangers." I stood again, this time with my full height and dignity, no longer pretending to be the frail, confused woman they had expected to manipulate. "That money was mine, Daniel, earned by your father and me through 45 years of hard work and careful planning. It was never your inheritance until I chose to leave it to you. And your behavior over these past months has convinced me that you don't deserve that choice. The St. Catherine's Community Foundation will use those resources to feed the hungry, house the homeless, and support families in crisis, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. People who need help, not people who see their aging mother as an obstacle to their financial plans. Jessica tried one more approach, her real estate training kicking in as she attempted to find a compromise. Mother, surely we can work something out. If you're concerned about our motivations, we can address that. We can arrange for better care options, more involvement in your daily life. But this donation, it's so extreme, so permanent. I looked at my daughter, seeing clearly for the first time how much she resembled her father, not in appearance, but in the practical way she approached problems. Harold would have been ashamed of what his children had become, but he also would have been proud of how I had handled their betrayal. Jessica, the decision is made and final. I've spent months watching you and your brothers plan my life as if I were already dead, as if my feelings and wishes were irrelevant to your grand design. You've treated me like an inconvenience to be managed rather than a person to be loved and respected. The truth is, I continued, addressing all three of my children, I would have been happy to leave you a generous inheritance if you had shown genuine care for my well-being. If you had visited because you wanted to spend time with me, not because you were monitoring my capacity to manage assets. If you had asked what I wanted for my future instead of telling me what was best for me. But you didn't do any of those things. Instead, you conspired to have me declared incompetent, to remove me from my home, and to control my assets for your own benefit. You turned what should have been a loving family relationship into a calculated business transaction, and now you're experiencing the consequences of that choice. The van driver, tired of waiting, walked up to the front door and rang the bell. The social worker answered, briefly explaining that the placement had been canceled due to changed circumstances. Through the window, I watched him drive away, taking with him the symbol of my children's failed plan. Kevin made one final attempt at reconciliation, his voice smaller and more genuine than it had been all day. Mom, I know we handled this wrong. Maybe we were too focused on the practical aspects and not enough on what you wanted. But we're still family. Surely there's a way to work through this. I studied my youngest son, seeing in his face the little boy who used to help me in the garden, who had cried when his goldfish died, who had once believed his mother was the wisest person in the world. That boy still existed somewhere inside, the man who had participated in this betrayal, but he was buried under years of selfishness and entitlement. Kevin, family relationships are built on love, respect, and trust. Over these past months, you and your siblings have demonstrated that you're capable of none of those things when it comes to your relationship with me. I'm 78 years. Old, not dead, and I'm certainly not the confused, helpless woman you believed you could manipulate. The social worker gathered her paperwork, clearly eager to escape the family drama that had erupted around her. Mrs. Thompson, she said, I'll be filing a report about this situation. Is there anything else you need from me today? I thanked her for her professionalism and walked her to the door, leaving my children standing in the living room where they had expected to finalize their control over my life. As she drove away, I returned to face Daniel, Jessica, and Kevin, who were huddled together like conspirators whose plot had been exposed. So what happens now, Mom? Daniel asked, his earlier rage replaced by a defeated resignation. What exactly do you expect from us? I expect nothing from you, Daniel. That's the point. I've learned not to expect love, respect, or genuine concern from my children. I've learned to rely on the kindness of friends like Helen, the guidance of professionals like Samuel Porter, and the satisfaction of using my resources to help people who truly need assistance. You're free to leave now, I continued, gesturing toward the door. You can return to your lives, secure in the knowledge that you no longer need to pretend to care about your aging mother's well-being. The burden of maintaining a relationship with me has been lifted from your shoulders." Jessica started to protest, but I held up my hand to stop her. "I'm not angry anymore," I told them honestly. "I'm simply done. Done pretending that you're sporadic. Visits mean you care about me. Done accepting your patronizing concern as love. Done allowing you to treat me like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be cherished." Helen, who had been quietly observing from the corner, stepped forward. "I think it's time for you all to leave. Margaret has had quite enough drama for one Thanksgiving, and she has other plans for the day." Indeed I did. My volunteer shift at the soup kitchen was starting in an hour, and I had promised Father Rodriguez I would help serve dinner to the families who had nowhere else to go on this holiday. It would be far more meaningful than the family gathering my children had originally planned, which had been less about gratitude and togetherness than about finalizing their plans for my future. As Daniel, Jessica, and Kevin gathered their coats and the useless paperwork they had brought to formalize my displacement, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in months. The performance was over, the truth was revealed, and my real life could finally begin again. Before they reached the door, Jessica turned back one final time. "You know we love you, don't you, Mother? Despite everything that's happened, we do love you." I looked at my daughter, this successful real estate agent who had spent months calculating the value of my possessions, and smiled sadly. "Jessica, I'm sure you believe that's true. But love isn't just a feeling, it's also actions and choices. And your actions over these past months have shown me exactly how much your love is worth." With that, they left, and I stood in my doorway watching them drive away, possibly for the last time. The house felt different already, lighter somehow, as if a burden had been lifted from its very walls. Helen appeared at my side, linking her arm through mine in the gesture of true friendship. "Well," she said with satisfaction, "that was better than any soap opera I've ever watched. You handled that beautifully, Margaret." I squeezed her arm gratefully. "Thank you for everything, Helen. I couldn't have done this without your help and support. You've been more family to me these past months than my own children." As we stood there in my doorway, looking out at the neighborhood where I had lived for so many years, I realized that this was not an ending but a beginning. Tomorrow, I would begin working with the St. Catherine's Community Foundation to implement the programs my donation would fund. I would continue living in my home as long as I was able, surrounded by friends who valued me for who I was, not what I owned. My children had taught me an important lesson about the difference between family and relatives, between love and obligation, between genuine care and calculated self-interest. It was a painful education, but ultimately a liberating one. The best part of all was knowing that my money would now feed hungry families, provide shelter for the homeless, and support community programs that made a real difference in people's lives. Instead of sitting in my children's bank accounts, funding their comfortable lifestyles, my life savings would create a legacy of compassion and service. That evening, as I sat in Harold's old recliner with a cup of tea, I reflected on the day's events. The Thanksgiving that was supposed to mark the end of my independence had instead become the beginning of my freedom. The children who had planned to inherit my assets had instead inherited the knowledge that their mother was far more formidable than they had ever imagined. And somewhere across town, families who had nothing were enjoying a warm meal at St. Catherine's Soup Kitchen, funded by the money my children had assumed would be theirs. It was, I decided, the most appropriate Thanksgiving gift I could have given, both to those in need and to myself. The phone rang once that evening, Kevin's number appearing on the caller ID. I let it go to voicemail, not ready to hear whatever apology or manipulation he might offer. Tomorrow would be soon enough to decide whether any of my children deserved a second chance at being part of my life. For tonight, I was content to sit in my own home, surrounded by my own possessions, secure in the knowledge that I had outmaneuvered those who had underestimated me. The confused, helpless old woman they had expected to control had never existed except in their imagination. The real Margaret Thompson, sharp, determined, and fully capable of managing her own affairs, had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to reveal herself. As I prepared for bed in the house they had planned to sell, using the assets they had expected to inherit, I couldn't help but smile. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight, I was exactly where I belonged. In my own home, living on my own terms, free from the manipulation and false concern of those who had thought they could determine my fate. The assisted living facility would have to find another resident. This Thompson was staying right where she was. The following morning brought an unusual quiet to my house on Maple Street. For the first time in months, I woke without the weight of deception pressing on my shoulders. No more pretending to be confused about simple tasks. No more carefully orchestrated displays of forgetfulness. No more allowing my children to speak about me as if I weren't in the room. The relief was intoxicating. I made my coffee in Harold's favorite mug, the one with the faded Thompson construction logo that he had used every morning for 20 years. As I sat at my kitchen table, watching the sunrise paint the backyard golden, I could almost feel his presence beside me, approving of what I had done. Harold had always been protective of those he loved, and he would have been furious to see how our children had treated me. The phone started ringing at 7:30, earlier than any of them usually called. Daniel's name appeared on the caller, ID first, followed immediately by Jessica, then Kevin. I let them all go to voicemail, curious to hear what they would say now that their plans had crumbled so spectacularly. Daniel's message was predictably aggressive. "Mom, we need to talk about what happened yesterday. This whole situation is completely unacceptable, and we're not going to let you destroy our family's future because you're having some kind of breakdown. Call me back immediately." Jessica's approach was more calculated, her real estate training evident in her attempt to find common ground. "Mother, I know yesterday was emotional for everyone, but let's not make any permanent decisions while feelings are running high. There are solutions we haven't explored yet, compromises that could benefit everyone. Please call me so we can discuss this rationally." Kevin's message surprised me with its apparent sincerity. "Mom, I didn't sleep at all last night thinking about what you said. Maybe we did handle things wrong, and maybe we were too focused on the money. But you're still our mother, and we're still your children. That has to count for something, doesn't it? I just want to understand what you need from us to fix this." I saved all 3 messages, knowing they might be useful later, but I wasn't ready to respond to any of them. Instead, I called Helen to thank her again for her support and to discuss what would likely happen next. "Margaret," she said, her voice warm with satisfaction, "I've been your neighbor for over 20 years, and yesterday was the most magnificent thing I've ever witnessed. The way you turned the tables on those 3 was absolutely masterful, but you know they're not going to give up easily, don't you?" Helen was right, of course. Daniel, Jessica, and Kevin had spent too much time and energy planning their takeover of my life to simply accept defeat. They would regroup, consult lawyers, look for weaknesses in my legal position, and probably attempt to have me evaluated again by a different doctor. I needed to be prepared for their next move. My first call was to Samuel Porter, who had been expecting to hear from me. "Maggie," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and concern, "I have to say, your performance yesterday was worthy of an Academy Award. But now comes the hard part. Your children are going to challenge this donation, and they're going to claim you weren't competent when you made it." Samuel had anticipated this reaction and had already begun preparing our defense. The key, he explained, was the timing and documentation of my decisions. All the legal transfers had been completed before the geriatric evaluation that my children had arranged, and we had multiple witnesses to my competency throughout the process. More importantly, we had Helen's recordings, which proved that my supposed confusion had been a deliberate performance designed to expose their true motivations. The very evidence they had hoped to use against me would now work in my favor. "We also have another advantage," Samuel continued. Father Rodriguez has agreed to provide a character witness statement about your volunteer work and mental acuity. He's worked with you closely on the soup kitchen program for 3 years, and he's prepared to testify that you've never shown any signs of cognitive decline or confusion. This was news to me, and I felt a surge of gratitude toward the parish priest who had become such an important part of my life since Harold's death. Father Rodriguez had always treated me as a valued partner in our community service work, never as a diminished elderly woman who needed to be managed or protected. I decided to visit St. Catherine's that afternoon, partly to thank Father Rodriguez for his support, but mostly to see the soup kitchen that would soon benefit from my donation. The church sat in the older part of Riverside, surrounded by modest homes and small businesses that had served the community for generations. Father Rodriguez was in his office when I arrived, preparing for the weekend services. "Margaret," he said, standing to embrace me warmly. "Helen called to tell me about yesterday's drama. I'm so proud of you for standing up to that shameful treatment from your children." We talked for over an hour about the community programs that my donation would support. The soup kitchen currently served about 60 meals every Tuesday and Thursday, but with additional funding, they could expand to daily service and add a weekend breakfast program. The homeless shelter, currently limited to emergency overnight stays, could offer longer-term housing assistance and job training programs. Most exciting to me was the proposal for a senior center that would provide meals, social activities, and support services for elderly residents who were struggling with isolation or limited resources. It would be exactly the kind of genuine community I had been seeking, built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than obligation or financial calculation. As Father Rodriguez walked me through the plans, I realized that my money would create something Harold and I had always dreamed of, a lasting legacy that would improve lives and strengthen our community for generations to come. It was so much more meaningful than simply funding my children's comfortable retirements or their children's college expenses. When I returned home that evening, I found Daniel waiting on my front porch. He had clearly been there for some time, pacing back and forth in that agitated way he had inherited from his father. Unlike Harold, though, Daniel's agitation stemmed from thwarted entitlement rather than genuine concern. "Mom," he said, standing as I approached the door, "we need to talk. Yesterday got out of hand, and things were said that shouldn't have been said. But we're family, and family works through problems together." I unlocked my door and gestured for him to follow me inside, curious to hear what new approach he had devised. Daniel had always been the most stubborn of my children, the one most likely to keep pushing until he got what he wanted. This conversation would tell me a lot about what I could expect from all 3 of them in the coming weeks. He settled into Harold's recliner without invitation, a presumption that would have annoyed me even before yesterday's revelations. Now it seemed like a perfect symbol of how my children viewed my home and possessions as already belonging to them. "Look," Daniel began, his tone carefully modulated to sound reasonable. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, and maybe you're right that we approached this wrong. Maybe we were too focused on the practical issues and not enough on what you wanted." I sat across from him, waiting to hear where this apparent concession would lead. Daniel was never one to admit fault without having an agenda behind it. "But, Mom," he continued, his voice taking on the patient tone adults use with unreasonable children, "you have to understand that donating $3 million to charity, that's not a normal decision for someone in your situation. It's the kind of extreme reaction that happens when people are overwhelmed or not thinking clearly." There it was, the subtle suggestion that my decision had been irrational, made by someone not capable of proper judgment. Daniel was trying a softer version of the same manipulation, acknowledging my feelings while still questioning my competency. "I'm perfectly clear about my decision, Daniel," I replied calmly. "I donated my assets to causes I care about because I discovered that my children were more interested in inheriting my money than in maintaining a relationship with me. Nothing about that decision was irrational or extreme. He shifted in his chair, clearly frustrated by my continued lucidity. But think about it from our perspective, Mom. We spent months worrying about you, trying to make sure you were safe and cared for. Maybe we made mistakes in how we handled it, but our intentions were good. Doesn't that count for something? I studied my eldest son, noting how he had reframed their behavior as concern rather than calculation, how he had transformed their systematic planning into spontaneous worry. It was almost impressive in its audacity. "Daniel," I said quietly, "I have recordings of your conversations with Jessica and Kevin where you discussed dividing up responsibilities for taking control of my assets. You talked about getting power of attorney as quickly as possible, about selling my house before I could object, about the inheritance you were protecting. At no point in those conversations did any of you discuss my happiness, my preferences, or my well-being." His face flushed red, but he pressed on. Those conversations were taken out of context. "Yes, we talked about practical matters, but that's because we love you and wanted to make sure you were protected. You can't judge our motives based on a few private conversations." The audacity of this statement left me speechless for a moment. He was asking me to ignore the evidence of his own words, to accept his revised narrative over the reality I had witnessed firsthand. "Daniel," I said finally, "your actions over these past months have shown me exactly what your love looks like. It looks like arranging medical evaluations to prove I'm incompetent. It looks like making decisions about my future without consulting me. It looks like treating me like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected." He stood up, abruptly, his frustration finally breaking through his attempt at reasonable discourse. "Fine, Mom, if that's how you want to see it. But let me ask you this. What happens when you really do need help? What happens when you actually can't manage on your own anymore? Who do you think is going to be there for you then?" The threat was implicit but clear. If I didn't restore their inheritance, they would abandon me when I genuinely needed assistance. It was exactly the kind of conditional love I had come to expect from them, affection tied directly to financial benefit. "I'll cross that bridge when I come to it, Daniel. And when I do, I'll arrange for care from people who respect me as a person, not people who see me as an obligation or an inconvenience. Professional caregivers, at least, are honest about the transactional nature of the relationship." He stared at me for a long moment, perhaps finally realizing that the mother he had known, the one who could be guilted into compliance, no longer existed. When he spoke again, his voice carried a hardness I had never heard before. "You know what, Mom? Maybe you're right. Maybe we were planning to inherit your money. Maybe we did want you in assisted living because it would be easier for everyone. But at least we cared enough to want you safe and provided for. Now you've got nothing to leave anyone, and when you need help, you'll find out how much your precious charity friends really care about you." With that, he stormed out, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. I sat in the sudden quiet of my living room, processing what had just happened. In trying to manipulate me one final time, Daniel had revealed the true depth of his selfishness and the conditional nature of his concern. The next few days brought a parade of attempts from Jessica and Kevin to salvage the situation. Jessica arrived unannounced on Saturday morning with coffee and pastries from my favorite bakery, settling into my kitchen as if the previous week's events had never happened. "Mother," she began, her tone bright and artificially cheerful, "I've been thinking about what you said about wanting more involvement in your life. What if we made some changes? What if I started visiting more regularly, not for any practical reasons, just to spend time together? We could go shopping, have lunch, do the things mothers and daughters are supposed to do." It was a tempting offer, the kind of relationship I had always wanted with my only daughter. But I had learned to look beyond the surface appeal to the underlying motivation. "Jessica," I asked gently, "are you offering to spend more time with me because you genuinely want a closer relationship, or because you're hoping I'll change my mind about the donation?" Her pause was telling. When she finally answered, Her voice lacked the conviction her words were trying to convey. Can't it be both? I mean, yes, I hope we can work through this financial situation, but I also realize I haven't been the daughter I should have been. Maybe this crisis is an opportunity for us to build something better. I appreciated her honesty, partial though it was. Jessica had always been the most emotionally intelligent of my children, the one most capable of recognizing when relationships needed repair. But she was also the most skilled at manipulation, able to package self-interest as sentiment. Over the next hour, she painted a picture of the closer relationship we could have, the grandmother role I could play in her teenagers' lives, the family traditions we could establish. It was everything I had wanted to hear from her for years, offered now when she needed something from me. When she finally left, promising to call soon to arrange our first mother-daughter outing, I felt a familiar sadness. Not because I was unmoved by her offers, but because I knew they were conditional on my restoration of their inheritance. If I maintained my position, these promised improvements in our relationship would evaporate as quickly as they had appeared. Kevin's approach was different, more direct and seemingly more genuine. He arrived on Sunday evening, looking haggard and uncertain in a way that reminded me of the sensitive child he had once been. "Mom," he said, settling onto my couch with none of Daniel's presumption or Jessica's artificial cheer. "I need to apologize. Not because I want you to change your mind about the money, though I won't lie and say I don't hope you will, but because what we did to you was wrong." I studied his face, looking for signs of the calculation that had characterized his siblings. Recent visits. Kevin had always been the most introspective of my children, the one most likely to genuinely examine his own behavior. "I keep thinking about Dad," he continued, his voice growing thick with emotion. "He would be ashamed of us, wouldn't he? The way we treated you, the way we planned your life like you were already gone. He would be furious, and he would be right to be." This acknowledgement of Harold's potential reaction hit me harder than I had expected. Kevin was right. His father would have been appalled by their behavior, and he would have protected me from their schemes just as fiercely as I had ultimately protected myself. We got so focused on the inheritance that we forgot you were still here, still living your life, still capable of making your own decisions, Kevin said, tears beginning to form in his eyes. I convinced myself we were helping you, but really we were helping ourselves to feel better about wanting your money while you were still alive to see it. His honesty was refreshing after Daniel's denials and Jessica's manipulations, but it also made the situation more painful. Kevin's genuine remorse showed me that my youngest son was still capable of growth and self-reflection, but it came too late to change what had already been done. "I don't know how to fix this, Mom," he admitted. "I don't know how to undo months of treating you like you didn't matter. And I understand if you can't forgive us, if you don't want us in your life anymore. But I want you to know that I recognize what we did was wrong, and I'm sorry." We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us struggling with the weight of what had been lost. Finally, I reached over and took his hand, feeling the calluses from his weekend woodworking hobby, the same hands that had once helped me plant flower gardens and build birdhouses. "Kevin," I said softly, "your apology means something to me because it's honest. You're not trying to manipulate me or convince me that your motives were pure. You're acknowledging that you and your siblings treated me badly, and that takes courage." He squeezed my hand, hope flickering in his expression. "But," I continued, "an apology doesn't undo the damage that's been done. It doesn't change the fact that for months, you participated in planning to have me declared incompetent so you could control my assets. It doesn't erase the conversations where you discussed my future as if my opinions were irrelevant." His face fell, but he nodded understanding. "I know," he said quietly. "I know it's not enough. I just wanted you to know that I understand what we did was wrong, even if I can't fix it." After he left, I found myself thinking about the differences between my 3 children and how their personalities had shaped their responses to this crisis. Daniel's reaction had been predictably aggressive, an attempt to bulldoze past my resistance through force of will and implied threats. Jessica had tried manipulation wrapped in the promise of improved relationship, offering what she thought I wanted in exchange for what she needed. Kevin alone had offered genuine accountability, acknowledging the harm they had caused without trying to minimize or excuse it. These different approaches told me everything I needed to know about their character and their capacity for growth. Daniel would continue to see me as an obstacle to his rightful inheritance. Jessica would keep trying to find the right combination of sentiment and strategy to change my mind. Kevin might eventually evolve into someone capable of genuine relationship, but the trust between us had been broken in ways that would take years to repair, if it could be repaired at all. The following week brought new developments that confirmed my suspicions about my children's determination to contest my donation. Samuel Porter called to inform me that Daniel had hired a lawyer, specializing in elder law and estate disputes, and that we should expect formal legal challenges to my competency and the validity of the transfers. The attorney he's hired, Samuel explained, is known for aggressive tactics in cases involving elderly clients and asset transfers. He'll probably start with demands for medical evaluations, psychiatric assessments, and depositions from anyone who witnessed your supposed decline. I felt a flutter of anxiety at the prospect of extended legal battles, but Samuel's voice was reassuring. The good news is that we have extensive documentation of your competency throughout the period in question. Helen's recordings, Father Rodriguez's witness statement, and the timing of the transfers all work in our favor. More importantly, the burden of proof is on them to demonstrate incompetency, not on us to prove competence. We also had an advantage that my children didn't know about yet. During my months of supposed confusion, I had been consulting with Dr. Hayes about my situation. He had been documenting my actual mental state throughout the period when I was performing cognitive decline for my children's benefit. His medical records would show a pattern of normal cognitive function, contradicting any claims about my incompetency. The legal challenge began formally the following Tuesday with a letter from Daniel's attorney demanding that I undergo extensive medical and psychological evaluation by court-appointed specialists. The letter painted a picture of a confused elderly woman who had been manipulated into making irrational financial decisions, and it requested immediate freezing of all asset transfers pending judicial review. Samuel had warned me to expect this, but seeing it in writing still felt like a violation. The letter described me in language that bore no resemblance to reality, portraying me as a victim of my own declining faculties rather than a competent adult who had made deliberate choices about my own assets. More troubling was the discovery that Daniel had been gathering what he believed was evidence of my incompetency. The letter referenced unpaid bills, household maintenance issues, and reports from unnamed witnesses about my confusion and forgetfulness. He had been documenting every instance of my carefully orchestrated performance, building a case that would have been compelling if it had been based on reality rather than deception. But two could play at that game. Helen and I spent the next several days organizing our own evidence, the recordings of my children's planning sessions, photographs of them searching through my financial documents during visits, and detailed logs of their behavior when they thought I was too confused to notice. We also had something Daniel didn't expect: cooperation from some of his own witnesses. The contractor he had hired to evaluate my home repairs agreed to testify that the problems I had reported were either minor or non-existent, and that I had seemed perfectly lucid during all his interactions with me. The handyman who had done the unnecessary work confirmed that I had been clear and specific in my instructions, showing no signs of confusion or cognitive decline. Even more damaging to Daniel's case was testimony from my bank manager, who confirmed that I had been managing my accounts competently throughout the period in question, and that my financial decisions had been consistent with someone of sound judgment. The large charitable donation had been processed through normal procedures, with all required documentation and waiting periods observed. As we prepared our response to Daniel's legal challenge, I realized that this battle would be about more than just money or legal technicalities. It would be a public examination of my relationship with my children, a court proceeding where our family's private dysfunction would become a matter of public record. The prospect was daunting, but I also found it liberating. For months, I had been living a lie, pretending to be someone I wasn't to expose the truth about my children's character. Now, finally, I would be able to tell my story honestly, to present evidence of what had really happened, and to let an objective judge determine whether my actions had been those of a competent adult or a confused elderly woman. The irony wasn't lost on me that my children, in their attempt to have me declared incompetent, were about to provide me with the perfect forum to demonstrate just how competent I actually was. They had spent months underestimating me, and they were about to make that mistake one final time in front of a judge who would have access to all the evidence they didn't know existed. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of my donation, but the future of my relationship with my children and my own independence. They had forced this battle by refusing to accept my decision, and now they would face the consequences of challenging someone who had been planning for this moment far longer than they realized. As I prepared for what would likely be the most important legal battle of my life, I felt the same sense of calm determination that had carried me through Harold's death and the months of deception that followed. My children had taught me that I could rely only on myself, and I was about to show them just how formidable a truly independent woman could be. The courthouse in downtown Riverside had always intimidated me during the few occasions I'd had reason to visit it over the years. Built in the 1920s from imposing gray stone, it represented the weight of legal authority in a way that made ordinary citizens feel small and vulnerable. Today, however, as I climbed the wide steps flanked by Samuel Porter and Helen Crawford, I felt none of that familiar anxiety. Instead, I experienced something closer to anticipation. The preliminary hearing to determine my mental competency had been scheduled for a Wednesday morning in Judge Patricia Kellerman's courtroom. Samuel had briefed me extensively on Judge Kellerman's reputation. Fair but thorough, with little patience for frivolous claims, but equally little tolerance for elder abuse. She had been on the bench for 15 years and had presided over numerous cases involving disputed wills and competency challenges. Daniel sat with his attorney, Marcus Webb, at the plaintiff's table, his expression carefully neutral, but his body language revealing his tension. Jessica and Kevin flanked him, both looking uncomfortable with the public nature of these proceedings. Behind them sat Stephanie, Daniel's wife, who had been surprisingly vocal in her support of the legal challenge, despite having barely tolerated me during family gatherings over the years. The irony of seeing my own children lined up against me in a court of law was not lost on me. These were the people I had raised, nurtured, and sacrificed for, now formally asking a judge to declare me mentally incompetent because I had chosen to donate my own money to charity rather than preserve their inheritance. Judge Kellerman called the session to order with the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to cutting through family drama to reach legal facts. She had reviewed all the preliminary filings, she announced, and was prepared to hear testimony regarding Margaret Thompson's mental state during the period when the charitable donations were executed. Marcus Webb rose first. His expensive suit and confident demeanor clearly intended to establish his credibility before he began dismantling mine. "Your Honor," he began, "this case represents a classic example of an elderly individual suffering from cognitive decline being taken advantage of by unscrupulous parties who encouraged her to make irrational financial decisions." He painted a picture of a confused widow, overwhelmed by grief and unable to manage her affairs, who had been manipulated into donating her life savings to religious organizations that had preyed upon her vulnerability. According to his narrative, I was a victim who needed the court's protection from my own poor judgment and the influences that had exploited my diminished capacity. The evidence he presented was compelling if you didn't know the truth behind. Aligned bank statements showing erratic bill payments, testimony from neighbors who had witnessed my apparent confusion during conversations, medical records indicating memory issues and disorientation. On paper, it looked like a clear case of cognitive decline requiring judicial intervention. Daniel took the witness stand first, his testimony carefully rehearsed to present himself as a concerned son who had noticed troubling changes in his mother's behavior. He described finding unpaid bills scattered around my house, conversations where I seemed lost and confused, and my apparent inability to manage simple household tasks that I had handled competently for decades. His performance was convincing, because it was based on real observations, just not real cognitive decline. Every instance of confusion he described had been genuine behavior, just behavior that was deliberately performed rather than naturally occurring. He spoke with the authority of someone who genuinely believed his own narrative, because he had never suspected that my decline had been carefully orchestrated. Jessica's testimony followed similar lines, focusing on her professional observations. As a real estate agent who regularly worked with elderly clients, she described warning signs she claimed to have noticed during our conversations, instances where I had seemed uncertain about financial matters or unable to follow complex discussions about property values and investment strategies. What made her testimony particularly effective was her apparent emotional distress while delivering it. Jessica had always been skilled at presenting herself sympathetically, and she managed to convey genuine anguish about watching her mother's supposed deterioration. The tears in her eyes as she described my confusion about family finances were real, even if the confusion itself had been fabricated. Kevin's testimony was the most reluctant of the three, his discomfort with the proceedings evident in his hesitant responses and frequent glances in my direction. His account focused more on changes in my personality and decision-making patterns, describing how I had become secretive about my finances and resistant to their offers of help with managing my affairs. The medical testimony came from Dr. Patricia Williams, the geriatrician who had evaluated me at my children's request. She testified about her findings of mild cognitive impairment and recommended supervision for financial decisions, reading directly from the report that had been based on my carefully crafted performance during our appointment. Her testimony was particularly damaging because it carried the weight of professional medical opinion. Dr. Williams had no reason to doubt the authenticity of the symptoms I had displayed, and her evaluation had been thorough and professionally conducted. The fact that I had been deliberately deceiving her during the assessment was not something she could have detected or anticipated. The most compelling witness for Daniel's case turned out to be Mrs. Eleanor Richmond, an elderly neighbor I barely knew, who testified about a conversation we had had at the grocery store several months earlier. According to her testimony, I had seemed confused about my shopping list, unable to remember what I had come to buy, and had asked her the same questions multiple times during our brief interaction. This testimony was particularly effective because Mrs. Richmond had no apparent motive to lie or embellish her account. She was simply reporting what she had observed, which happened to be one of my more elaborate performances designed to create witnesses to my supposed decline. The fact that I had been acting deliberately made no difference to the impact of her sincere testimony about my apparent confusion. When Marcus Webb concluded his presentation of evidence, the case against my competency seemed overwhelming. The pattern of cognitive decline he had established through multiple witnesses appeared consistent and progressive, building to the irrational decision to donate millions of dollars to charity, instead of preserving assets for my family's security. Then it was Samuel Porter's turn to present our defense, and the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically. Samuel began by calling Helen Crawford to the witness stand, where she calmly identified herself as my neighbor and close friend of over 20 years. Her testimony would establish a different narrative entirely. Helen described the sophisticated recording equipment we had installed in my home, the careful documentation of my children's visits, and the conversations she had witnessed between Daniel, Jessica, and Kevin about their plans for my future. She testified about my clear instructions regarding the recording system, my strategic planning of the supposed episodes of confusion, and my consistent lucidity during our private conversations throughout the entire period in question. The recordings themselves were then admitted into evidence, despite vigorous objections from Marcus Webb about privacy violations and entrapment. Judge Kellerman ruled that since the recordings had been made in my own home with my own consent, they were admissible as evidence of my mental state and my children's motivations. The impact of hearing Daniel, Jessica, and Kevin's actual voices discussing their plans was devastating to their case. Their casual conversation about dividing responsibilities for taking control of my assets, their calculations of inheritance values, and their dismissive references to my opinions and preferences painted a picture completely different from their courtroom testimony about loving concern for my well-being. Most damaging was a recording from several weeks before the donation, where Daniel could be heard saying, "We need to move faster on getting power of attorney. Every day we wait is another day she could do something crazy with the money. The money isn't really hers anymore anyway. It's our inheritance, and we have a right to protect it." Samuel then called Dr. William Hayes, my longtime family physician, who testified about my actual mental state throughout the period in question. Dr. Hayes revealed that I had been consulting with him about the situation with my children, that he had been monitoring my cognitive function through regular appointments, and that his medical records showed no signs of mental decline or confusion. His testimony was particularly powerful because he had been documenting my actual mental state while Dr. Williams had been evaluating my performed symptoms. The contrast between his records of normal cognitive function and her assessment of impairment highlighted the deliberate nature of my deception. Father Rodriguez's testimony provided additional evidence of my competency through his detailed account of our work together on community service projects. He described complex planning sessions for the soup kitchen expansion, sophisticated budgeting, discussions for various charitable programs, and strategic conversations about maximizing the impact of potential donations. His testimony painted a picture of someone actively engaged in detailed planning and decision-making, someone capable of understanding complex financial and organizational concepts, someone who had been considering charitable giving options for years, months before making her final decision. Father Rodriguez's professional relationship with me provided an objective perspective on my mental acuity that contradicted the family narrative of decline and confusion. The surprise witness was Mrs. Dorothy Hanson from the bank, who testified about my account management during the disputed period. She revealed that I had been handling all my own banking throughout the months when my children claimed I was confused and forgetful, that my financial decisions had been consistent with someone of sound judgment, and that the large charitable donations had been processed through standard procedures with all required documentation properly completed. Mrs. Hanson's testimony was particularly effective because it addressed the core question of financial competency directly. She described our detailed conversations about the donation process, my clear understanding of the legal and tax implications, and my explicit instructions about timing and documentation. Her testimony made it clear that whatever confusion I might have displayed elsewhere, I had been completely lucid and competent when managing my actual financial affairs. Perhaps the most dramatic moment came when Samuel called me to testify, on my own behalf. I had been dreading this moment despite our extensive preparation, knowing that my children would be hearing the full truth about my deception for the first time in this public forum. Under Samuel's gentle questioning, I explained the entire situation from my perspective. I described the gradual realization that my children were more interested in my assets than my well-being, the decision to test their motivations through performed confusion, and the careful planning that had gone into both the deception and the subsequent charitable donations. I testified about the systematic way my children had dismissed my opinions and preferences, their conversations about my future that excluded any consideration of my wishes, and their assumption that they could control my decisions by having me declared incompetent. I explained how their behavior had convinced me that they viewed me as an obstacle to their inheritance rather than a mother deserving of respect and consideration. The most emotional part of my testimony came when I described the actual decision-making process behind the charitable donations. I explained how I had spent months researching various organizations, consulting with financial advisors about tax implications, and carefully considering how to structure the gifts for maximum impact. The donations hadn't been impulsive or irrational decisions, but the culmination of extensive planning and deliberation. Marcus Webb's cross-examination was aggressive, but ultimately ineffective. He tried to characterize my deception as evidence of mental instability, arguing that a rational person wouldn't engage in such elaborate subterfuge against their own family. He suggested that my ability to maintain the performance indicated a level of paranoia and distrust that itself suggested psychological impairment. But his attacks only served to highlight the sophistication and consistency of my planning. The more he emphasized the complexity of my deception, the more he demonstrated my cognitive abilities and strategic thinking. His attempts to paint me as unstable for suspecting my children's motives were undermined by the evidence of their actual behavior captured in the recordings. The testimony phase concluded with character witnesses who had worked with me on various community projects over the years. These individuals testified about my organizational skills, my attention to detail, and my consistent involvement in complex charitable activities that required significant planning and oversight. Their collective testimony painted a picture of someone actively engaged in her community, capable of managing multiple responsibilities simultaneously, and committed to causes that extended far beyond her own family's interests. This testimony provided context for my charitable donations, showing them as consistent with a lifetime pattern of community involvement rather than sudden irrational impulses. Judge Kellerman recessed the proceedings for lunch, giving both sides time to prepare their closing arguments. As I sat in the courthouse cafeteria with Samuel and Helen, I felt cautiously optimistic about our presentation, but nervous about the judge's ultimate decision. The legal standard for incompetency was significant, but family pressure in these cases could sometimes influence judicial thinking in unpredictable ways. Samuel was more confident than I was about our prospects. "Maggie," he said, reviewing his notes from the morning's testimony, "their case essentially collapsed when we played those recordings. It's hard to argue that someone needs protection from their own poor judgment when the evidence shows they were competent enough to expose and outmaneuver the people supposedly trying to help them." Helen was characteristically direct in her assessment. "Those children of yours hung themselves with their own words, Margaret. No judge is going to believe they were acting out of love after hearing them discuss your inheritance like it was already theirs to divide up." The afternoon session began with closing arguments, starting with Marcus Webb's attempt to salvage his client's case, despite the damaging evidence that had emerged during testimony. He focused on the allegedly manipulative influences that had encouraged my charitable giving, arguing that religious organizations had taken advantage of my grief and isolation to redirect my assets toward their purposes. His argument required him to essentially ignore the extensive evidence of my competency and strategic thinking, instead characterizing my actions as the result of undue influence by parties who had exploited my emotional vulnerability. It was a creative approach, but one that required the judge to overlook substantial evidence to the contrary. Samuel's closing argument was methodical and devastating. He walked through the evidence systematically, demonstrating how each element of Daniel's case had been contradicted by more reliable testimony and documentation. He emphasized the children's admitted financial motivations, their systematic planning to control my assets, and their assumption that they could manipulate me through false claims of concern for my welfare. Most importantly, he addressed the central legal question directly: whether I had possessed the mental capacity to make rational decisions about my own assets at the time the donations were executed. The evidence showed not only that I had been competent, but that I had been competent enough to devise and execute a sophisticated plan to test and expose my children's motives. The sophistication of my planning, Samuel argued, was itself the strongest evidence of my mental acuity. Someone suffering from cognitive decline wouldn't have been capable of maintaining such an elaborate deception over several months, documenting the evidence systematically and timing the revelations for maximum impact. Judge Kellerman's decision came after only 30 minutes of deliberation, a remarkably short time that suggested she had found the case straightforward despite its emotional complexity. She returned to the bench with a stern expression that gave no hint of her conclusions until she began speaking. After reviewing all the testimony and evidence presented, Judge Kellerman announced, "This court finds that Margaret Thompson possessed full mental capacity and competency during the period when the charitable donations in question were executed. The evidence clearly demonstrates that Mrs. Thompson was not only capable of making rational financial decisions, but was sophisticated enough in her planning to expose and document the motivations of those who sought to control her assets." The ruling was a complete vindication of my position and a thorough rejection of my children's claims. Judge Kellerman went further, noting that the evidence suggested the competency challenge itself had been motivated more by disappointment over lost inheritance than by genuine concern for my welfare. "The court is particularly troubled," she continued, "by evidence suggesting that the plaintiffs in this case were actively planning to assume control of the defendant's assets based on their own assessment of her competency, rather than seeking appropriate professional evaluation and legal procedures for someone they genuinely believed needed protection." Her ruling not only confirmed the validity of my charitable donations, but also included a strong rebuke of my children's behavior throughout the process. She noted that their systematic planning to control my assets, combined with their failure to consult me about my own preferences, suggested a fundamental misunderstanding of their legal and ethical responsibilities toward an aging parent. As Judge Kellerman concluded her ruling and dismissed the case, I felt a complex mixture of relief, vindication, and sadness. The legal battle was over, and I had prevailed completely, but the cost had been the final destruction of my relationship with my children and the public exposure of our family's dysfunction. Daniel, Jessica, and Kevin sat in stunned silence as the implications of the ruling sank in. Not only had they failed to overturn my donations, but their motivations and behavior had been officially documented and criticized by a sitting judge. The court record would permanently reflect their attempt to manipulate and control their mother's assets through false claims of incompetency. As we gathered our papers and prepared to leave the courthouse, I noticed that none of my children approached me or attempted to speak. They huddled with Marcus Webb, presumably discussing whether to appeal the decision, though Samuel had warned me that appeals in competency cases were rarely successful and would only result in additional legal fees and public scrutiny. Outside the courthouse, Helen linked arms with me as we descended the same steps I had climbed that morning with such different expectations. The legal battle was over, but its resolution marked the beginning of a new phase of my life, one where I would be truly independent from family obligations and free to pursue the charitable and community work that had always given me the greatest satisfaction. The victory felt bittersweet because it had required me to destroy my relationships with my own children to achieve it. But as we walked toward Samuel's car, I realized that those relationships had already been destroyed by their own actions and attitudes. The court proceedings had simply made that destruction official and public. The judge's ruling had validated everything I had believed about my children's motivations and my own competency. More importantly, it had established my legal right to dispose of my assets as I saw fit, free from interference by family members who disagreed with my choices. The charitable donations would stand, and the community programs they would fund could move forward without further legal challenges. As we drove away from the courthouse, I thought about Harold and how proud he would have been of the way I had handled this situation. I had protected our life's work from being squandered by ungrateful children, and I had ensured that our resources would continue to benefit others long after I was gone. The legal victory was complete, but the personal cost had been enormous. I was now truly alone in the world, having lost my children's love and respect in the process of defending my independence and my right to make my own decisions. It was a price I had been willing to pay, but one that would leave permanent scars on my heart. The weeks following the court ruling brought an unexpected silence that felt both liberating and isolating. For months, My life had been consumed by the drama of my children's manipulation and the preparation for legal battle. Now, with that conflict resolved decisively in my favor, I found myself facing a different kind of challenge, learning to live authentically after years of strategic deception. The immediate aftermath of Judge Kellerman's ruling had been surprisingly anticlimactic. I had expected to feel triumphant, vindicated, perhaps even euphoric about my complete legal victory. Instead, I experienced a profound sense of emptiness, as if the intense focus required for the battle had been masking a deeper loss that I was only now beginning to fully comprehend. Helen noticed my subdued mood during our weekly coffee sessions at Murphy's Diner, the small downtown establishment where we had been meeting for years to discuss neighborhood gossip and share observations about our respective families. Our conversations had become more frequent during the legal proceedings, but now they served a different purpose, helping me process the emotional aftermath of cutting ties with my children. "You know, Margaret," Helen said one Tuesday morning, stirring cream into her coffee with the methodical precision she applied to everything, "I've been watching you for 3 weeks now, and you're not acting like someone who just won the biggest fight of her life. You're acting like someone who's lost something important." Helen's observation was characteristically direct and uncomfortably accurate. I had won everything I had fought for: legal recognition of my competency, validation of my right to dispose of my assets as I chose, and complete freedom from my children's attempts to control my life. But the victory had come at the cost of relationships that, however damaged they had become, had still been the primary connections to my family and my history. "I suppose I am grieving," I admitted, surprised by the relief I felt at finally acknowledging the emotion I had been avoiding. Not for the relationships as they actually were, but for the relationships I had always hoped they could become. The court ruling made it clear that those hopes were never realistic. Helen nodded understanding, her weathered hands wrapped around her coffee mug in a gesture that somehow conveyed both comfort and acceptance. "Sometimes the hardest part of winning is realizing what you've had to sacrifice to get there. But Margaret, you need to remember that you didn't destroy those relationships. Your children destroyed them through their own choices and behavior." The truth of her words didn't make the loss any less painful, but it did help me begin to separate my grief over the situation from any guilt about my role in creating it. I had spent decades trying to build meaningful connections with Daniel, Jessica, and Kevin, accommodating their indifference, excusing their selfishness, and hoping that eventually they would see me as more than an inconvenience or a resource to be managed. The recording equipment Helen and I had installed in my home was still in place, though it no longer served its original purpose of documenting my children's scheming. Instead, the house felt unnaturally quiet, empty of the voices that had filled it during their frequent visits throughout the months of their planning. The silence was peaceful, but also lonely in ways I hadn't anticipated. Father Rodriguez had become an increasingly important source of support during this adjustment period. Our work together on the expanded community programs funded by my donation provided both practical focus and emotional grounding as I navigated this new phase of my independence. The priest understood loss in ways that secular counselors often couldn't, having ministered to countless parishioners through similar family estrangements and betrayals. During one of our planning sessions for the new senior center, Father Rodriguez addressed the elephant in the room with the gentle directness that made him such an effective counselor. "Margaret, you've accomplished something remarkable with this donation, but I can see that the personal cost has been significant. Have you given any thought to what reconciliation might look like if your children ever decide they want to rebuild these relationships?" His question forced me to confront something I had been avoiding: whether I would be willing to forgive my children if they approached me with genuine remorse and a commitment to treating me with respect. The court proceedings had revealed the depth of their selfishness and calculation, but they had also exposed my own capacity for long-term deception and strategic manipulation. "I don't know if reconciliation is possible, Father," I replied honestly. "The trust has been broken so completely. not just by what they tried to do, but by how they went about it. They spent months discussing my future as if I were already dead, making plans for my life that completely ignored my wishes and preferences. Even if they apologized, how could I ever believe they were sincere and not just trying another approach to get what they want? Father Rodriguez listened thoughtfully, his expression showing the patient consideration he brought to all complex moral questions. Trust, once broken, is perhaps the most difficult thing to repair, he acknowledged. But forgiveness doesn't require trust, Margaret. Forgiveness is something you do for your own peace of mind, not necessarily to restore relationships to their previous state. His words stayed with me as I continued to adjust to my new reality. The legal victory had given me complete control over my life and assets, but it had also left me with the practical challenge of building a meaningful existence without the family relationships that had previously provided structure and connection, however dysfunctional they had been. The community work became increasingly central to my daily routine. The St. Catherine's Soup Kitchen expansion was moving forward rapidly, with construction beginning on additional serving areas and storage facilities that would allow us to triple our capacity. I found myself spending most afternoons at the church, working with volunteers to plan menus, coordinate donations, and organize the staffing schedule for our expanded operations. This work provided both practical purpose and emotional satisfaction, in ways that my previous life had not. Unlike my children, who had valued me primarily for what I could provide them, the people I worked with at St. Catherine's appreciated my contributions for their own sake and treated me as a valued team member rather than someone to be managed or protected. The homeless shelter project was even more complex and rewarding. The donation had allowed us to purchase and renovate a former hotel downtown, creating not just emergency overnight accommodation, but transitional housing with support services designed to help people rebuild their lives. My business experience from working with Harold proved invaluable in managing contractors, negotiating with suppliers, and overseeing the renovation process. Working on these projects introduced me to people whose perspectives on family and loyalty were very different from my own experiences. Many of the shelter residents had been abandoned or betrayed by their own families, left to navigate poverty and homelessness without the safety net that even dysfunctional family relationships typically provide. Their resilience and gratitude for simple kindnesses put my own family troubles into a broader context. One resident in particular, a woman named Patricia who had been living in her car after losing her job and her apartment, became someone I talked with regularly during my volunteer shifts. Patricia was about Jessica's age. With 2 teenage children she was desperately trying to keep in school, despite their unstable housing situation. "Mrs. Thompson," Patricia said during one of our conversations, "I don't understand why your children would treat you the way they did. My kids and I don't have much, but we take care of each other. Family is supposed to be about love and support, not about what you can get from each other." Patricia's comment highlighted something I had been gradually realizing. My children's behavior wasn't just personally hurtful, it was actually aberrant in the context of normal family relationships. Most adult children, even those dealing with aging parents and inheritance issues, didn't resort to systematic deception and legal manipulation to control their parents' lives and assets. The contrast between Patricia's fierce loyalty to her children despite their difficult circumstances and my own children's calculated betrayal despite their comfortable lives was stark and painful. It reinforced my growing understanding that the fault in our relationships lay not with unrealistic expectations on my part, but with fundamental character flaws in Daniel, Jessica, and Kevin. As autumn progressed into winter, I began receiving indirect communications from my children through various intermediaries. The first came through Dr. Hayes, who mentioned during a routine appointment that Daniel had called his office asking about my health and emotional state following the court proceedings. Dr. Hayes had appropriately refused to discuss my medical information, but he reported that Daniel seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being. Jessica's approach was more subtle and manipulative. She began attending services at St. Catherine's, sitting in the back pews and making a point of participating in the collection for the soup kitchen. Father Rodriguez mentioned her presence during one of our planning meetings, noting that she had asked him to tell me she was praying for my happiness and peace of mind. Kevin's attempt at communication was the most direct. He sent a handwritten letter to my home address, a brief note expressing his continued remorse for their treatment of me and his hope that someday we might find a way to repair our relationship. The letter made no mention of the inheritance or any desire to change my financial decisions, focusing instead on his regret over the loss of family connection. Samuel Porter advised caution in responding to any of these overtures, warning that my children might be testing the waters for a new approach to challenging my decisions or manipulating my emotions. The legal battle was over, but that didn't prevent them from trying to influence me through guilt, sympathy, or false demonstrations of affection. I found myself genuinely conflicted about how to respond to these gestures. Part of me wanted to believe that the court proceedings had shocked my children into recognizing their mistakes and genuinely changing their attitudes toward me. Another part of me remembered their months of calculated deception and wondered whether these new approaches were simply more sophisticated versions of the same basic manipulation. The answer came unexpectedly through Helen, who had maintained her informal surveillance of neighborhood activities and continued to monitor any unusual activity around my home. She reported that Jessica had been driving past my house regularly, sometimes parking across the street for extended periods, as if trying to work up the courage to approach my door. More significantly, Helen had witnessed a heated argument between Daniel and Kevin in the parking lot of Thompson Construction, Harold's old business that Daniel had taken over after his father's death. The argument, which Helen observed from her car while running errands, appeared to be about their next steps regarding my situation and whether they should continue trying to restore the relationship or accept that the inheritance was permanently lost. The content of their argument, as Helen reported it, was revealing. Daniel apparently wanted to explore legal options for challenging the charitable donations on different grounds, possibly claiming undue influence by Father Rodriguez or the church. Kevin opposed this approach, arguing that further legal action would only damage their public reputations and confirm their mercenary motivations. Jessica's position, according to Helen's observations, seemed to be somewhere in between. She wanted to continue trying to rebuild the personal relationship with me, but Helen suspected this was primarily motivated by a belief that emotional reconciliation might eventually lead to financial reconsideration of the donations. This intelligence confirmed my suspicions that my children's recent gestures of concern and remorse were not as genuine as they appeared. They were still fundamentally focused on the money rather than the relationship, still calculating rather than truly repentant. The court ruling had forced them to change their tactics, but not their underlying motivations. The realization was simultaneously disappointing and liberating. Disappointing because it meant that any hope for genuine reconciliation was likely unrealistic, but liberating because it freed me from the emotional burden of wondering whether I should respond to their overtures or give them another chance to demonstrate changed behavior. Winter brought unexpected complications in the form of community pressure and social isolation that I hadn't fully anticipated. Word of the court proceedings had spread throughout Riverside, and public opinion was divided about my actions. Some community members admired my independence and charitable generosity, while others viewed my treatment of my children as harsh and unforgiving. The controversy became particularly acute at the Riverside Country Club, where Harold and I had been members for over 30 years, and where I had maintained friendships with several other widows who had been navigating similar challenges with their own aging and inheritance issues. Some of these women expressed support for my position, sharing their own stories of adult children who seemed more interested in inheritance than relationship. Others, however, were clearly uncomfortable with the precedent my actions might set. Margaret Hoffman, whose son managed her investments, was particularly vocal in her criticism during the club's monthly luncheon for senior members. "I think Margaret Thompson has been too harsh on her children," she announced to our table. "Adult children make mistakes, but families should forgive and work together, not cut each other off completely over money matters. The social pressure was subtle but persistent, reflecting broader community values about family loyalty and the obligations of aging parents to preserve wealth for their children's benefit. Some people seemed to view my charitable donations as selfish indulgence, rather than legitimate exercise of my right to dispose of my own assets. This criticism was particularly painful because it came from people whose opinions I had valued and whose friendship I had enjoyed for many years. The isolation forced me to confront whether my actions had been motivated by justice and self-preservation, as I believed, or by vindictiveness and spite, as some observers suggested. Father Rodriguez helped me work through these doubts during our regular conversations about the community programs and their impact on local families in need. The shelter residents we were housing, he pointed out, were benefiting from resources that would otherwise have remained in private bank accounts, earning interest for my children's eventual comfort. Margaret, he said during one particularly difficult conversation about community criticism, you made a choice to use your resources to help people who genuinely need assistance, rather than people who simply want financial security they haven't earned. That choice has fed hungry families, housed homeless individuals, and created opportunities for people who had lost hope. How can that be selfish or vindictive? His perspective helped me maintain confidence in my decisions despite the social pressure, but it didn't eliminate the loneliness that came from being estranged from my children and criticized by some members of my social circle. The independence I had fought so hard to achieve came with costs I was still learning to navigate. The most unexpected consequence of my legal victory was the attention it attracted from other elderly individuals dealing with similar family pressures. I began receiving phone calls and letters from strangers who had heard about my case and wanted advice about their own situations with manipulative adult children or relatives trying to control their assets and living arrangements. These contacts were both flattering and overwhelming. People seemed to view me as some kind of expert on elder independence and family manipulation, seeking guidance on everything from recognizing warning signs of financial abuse to strategies for maintaining autonomy in the face of family pressure. I was touched by their confidence in my wisdom, but also aware that my situation had been unique in ways that might not translate to their circumstances. One caller particularly affected me. An 80-year-old man named Robert, whose daughter had been gradually taking control of his finances under the guise of helping him simplify his affairs. His situation was eerily similar to what mine had been, complete with claims about his declining competency and suggestions that assisted living would be better for his safety and well-being. Robert's call reminded me that the problem I had faced with my children was not unique or unusual, but part of a broader pattern of financial elder abuse that often went unrecognized because it was disguised as family concern. My legal victory had been important, not just for my own independence, but as a precedent that might help other elderly individuals protect themselves from similar manipulation. This realization gave new meaning to the criticism I had faced from some community members. Their discomfort with my actions might stem not from genuine concern about family relationships, but from recognition that my precedent threatened their own assumptions about aging parents' obligations to preserve wealth for their children's benefit, regardless of how those children treated them. As winter deepened and the anniversary of Harold's death approached, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed in the year since my children had first begun their campaign to control my assets and living situation. The grieving widow they had expected to manipulate had evolved into someone far more formidable and independent than any of us had anticipated. The charitable programs funded by my donation were now operating at full capacity, serving hundreds of meals each week and providing shelter and support services to dozens of individuals and families. The senior center had opened to enthusiastic community response, offering not just meals and social activities, but educational programs and health services that were making a real difference in the lives of elderly residents who might otherwise be isolated and struggling. These tangible results of my decision provided daily validation that I had made the right choice in donating my assets rather than preserving them for children who had proven themselves unworthy of such a legacy. The money Harold and I had worked so hard to accumulate was now creating ongoing benefit for people who genuinely needed help, rather than sitting in investment accounts, earning returns for individuals who already enjoyed comfortable lives. The personal cost had been enormous, but the public benefit was undeniable. As I watched families gather for meals at the soup kitchen or saw formerly homeless individuals moving into permanent housing through our shelter programs, I knew that my sacrifice of family relationships had been worthwhile. The transformation was not yet complete, however. I was still learning to live without the family connections that had provided structure and meaning to my life for so many years, still navigating the social consequences of my decisions, and still dealing with the emotional aftermath of discovering just how little my children had valued me as a person rather than as a financial resource. But I was also discovering new sources of purpose and satisfaction in community service, new friendships with people who valued me for my contributions rather than my assets, and a new sense of independence that came from making decisions based on my own values rather than family expectations or social pressures. The legal battle was over, but the real work of building a meaningful life on my own terms was just beginning. The charitable donations had been the means to an end, not the end itself. The true victory would be measured not by the court ruling that validated my competency, but by the life I built with the freedom that ruling had secured. Spring arrived in Riverside with an unusual warmth that seemed to mirror the changes taking place in my life. 2 years had passed since that dramatic Thanksgiving confrontation with my children, and the woman who sat in her garden planning the day's activities bore little resemblance to the grieving widow who had once desperately sought approval from ungrateful offspring. The St. Catherine's Community Foundation had grown beyond anyone's wildest expectations, expanding from a small church charity into a regional model for comprehensive social services. The success had attracted attention from foundations and government agencies across Illinois, leading to additional funding that multiplied the impact of my original donation many times over. What had begun as an act of defiance against my children's manipulation had evolved into a legacy that would outlast all of us. My days now followed a rhythm that would have been unimaginable during the years when I defined myself primarily as Harold's widow and the mother of 3 ungrateful children. Each morning began with coffee in the garden Harold and I had planted, together, followed by planning calls with the foundation staff, afternoon volunteer work at whichever program needed attention, and evenings spent either with Helen or reading in the peaceful solitude of my own home. The house on Maple Street had become truly mine in ways it never had been during my marriage or the early years of widowhood. Without the constant anxiety about my children's visits and their judgment of my choices, I had felt free to redecorate, according to my own tastes, to display the artwork and furniture that gave me pleasure rather than what impressed others, and to use the space in ways that supported my new activities and interests. The dining room had been converted into a home office where I managed foundation correspondence and kept track of the various programs we funded. Harold's workshop in the basement had become a sorting and storage area for donated goods bound for our shelter residents. The formal living room, where my children had staged their final confrontation, now served as a meeting space for the volunteer coordinators who helped me manage our expanding operations. Helen remained my closest confidant and partner in these endeavors. Her natural organizational skills and sharp eye for human nature, making her invaluable in evaluating both potential programs and the people who sought our assistance. Our friendship had deepened through shared purpose in ways that my relationships with my children never had, built on mutual respect and genuine care rather than obligation or expectation. The success of our programs had brought recognition that still surprised me. The mayor had presented me with a key to the city during a ceremony honoring local philanthropists. The state's senior advocate organization had given me their Lifetime Achievement Award for innovative approaches to elder independence. Most meaningfully, The National Association of Community Foundations had featured our work in their annual report as an example of how individual donations could catalyze broader social change. These accolades were gratifying, but the real satisfaction came from the daily evidence of lives being changed. Patricia, the homeless mother I had met during my early volunteer work, now managed our job training program and had moved her family into permanent housing. Robert, the elderly man who had called seeking advice about his manipulative daughter, had successfully fought off his family's attempts to control his assets and had become a volunteer advocate for other seniors facing similar pressures. The ripple effects extended far beyond our immediate community. The legal precedent established by my competency case had been cited in similar proceedings across several states, helping other elderly individuals protect their independence from family members who sought to exploit their age for financial gain. Samuel Porter had been invited to speak at elder law conferences about strategies for documenting competency and exposing financial abuse disguised as family concern. My children had eventually stopped their various attempts at reconciliation, though the process had taken nearly a year and had involved increasingly desperate and transparent manipulation attempts. Daniel had tried enlisting his children, my grandchildren, to approach me with requests for family reunification that were clearly scripted by adults. Jessica had made a show of volunteering at St. Catherine's for several months, performing acts of service that were obviously intended to demonstrate her reformed character rather than arising from genuine commitment to our mission. Kevin's efforts had been the most persistent and the most painful, because they seemed to contain elements of genuine remorse mixed with continued self-interest. He had written me dozens of letters over the months following the court case, sometimes apologizing for his behavior, sometimes trying to explain his financial pressures, sometimes pleading for a chance to rebuild our relationship. His communications revealed a man struggling to reconcile his love for his mother with his resentment over the inheritance he felt had been stolen from him. The final communication from any of my children had come 18 months after the court ruling. A formal letter from Daniel's attorney informing me that they were abandoning any further legal challenges to my donations and asking me to sign a document confirming that I had no intention of including them in any future estate planning. The letter's cold, businesslike tone made it clear that they had finally accepted the permanence of their financial loss, even if they couldn't bring themselves to acknowledge the moral failure that had led to it. Signing that document had felt like finalizing a divorce, the legal termination of relationships that had already died emotionally. I felt sadness at the formal end of my role as mother to Daniel, Jessica, and Kevin, but also relief that the uncertainty was finally over. There would be no more strategic overtures, no more manipulation disguised as concern, no more false hope that they might somehow evolve into the loving, respectful children I had always wanted them to be. The broader community's reaction to my situation had evolved as well. The initial criticism from some quarters had given way to grudging respect as the success of our charitable programs became undeniable. Even Margaret Hoffman, who had been among my harshest critics at the country club, had eventually approached me to discuss establishing a similar foundation with her own estate, having concluded that my approach might be preferable to leaving assets to children who showed little appreciation for their parents' sacrifices. The shift in community opinion reflected a broader conversation about aging, independence, and family responsibility that my case had helped to initiate. Articles in the local newspaper explored the growing problem of financial elder abuse by family members, and social service agencies reported increased calls from elderly individuals seeking advice about protecting themselves from adult children who seemed more interested in inheritance than relationship. Father Rodriguez had become not just a professional colleague, but a true friend whose wisdom and perspective helped me navigate the complex emotions that came with my new life. During one of our regular conversations about the Foundation's work, he observed something that had been gradually becoming clear to me as well. "Margaret," he said as we reviewed applications for our emergency assistance program, "I've been watching you for 3 years now, And I think you've discovered something important about the difference between being needed and being valued. Your children needed you for your money and your compliance with their plans, but they never valued you as an individual with your own thoughts, feelings, and desires. His observation captured something essential about the transformation I had undergone. For decades, I had confused being needed with being loved, accepting my children's demands and expectations as evidence of family connection rather than recognizing them as forms of exploitation. The people I worked with now in our various programs valued my contributions without trying to control or manipulate me, and their appreciation felt genuine in ways that my children's attention never had. The foundation work had also introduced me to a different model of legacy than the traditional approach of leaving assets to children. Instead of preserving wealth for people who already enjoyed comfortable lives, I was investing in programs that would continue helping vulnerable individuals long after I was gone. The soup kitchen would keep serving meals, the shelter would keep housing families, and the senior center would keep providing support and community for isolated elderly residents, creating an ongoing impact that would far exceed anything my fee children could have accomplished with inherited money. As the second anniversary of my Thanksgiving confrontation approached, I found myself reflecting on the profound changes that had transformed not just my daily routine, but my entire understanding of purpose and value. The woman who had once apologized for taking up space in her own home now managed a budget of over $500,000 annually and supervised programs that employed dozens of people and served hundreds of families. The confidence I had discovered during the months of strategic deception had evolved into genuine self-assurance based on real accomplishments and meaningful relationships. I no longer needed to perform competency for skeptical observers. My work spoke for itself, and the people who mattered recognized and respected my contributions without requiring constant proof of my abilities. Helen and I had decided to host a small celebration at the foundation offices to mark the second anniversary of our program's establishment, inviting the volunteers, staff members, and community partners who had made our success possible. As I prepared remarks for the occasion, I realized that I wanted to address not just our accomplishments, but the personal journey that had led to this unexpected chapter of my life. The evening of our celebration, I stood before a room filled with people whose lives had been touched by our work in various ways. Patricia was there with her teenagers, who were both thriving in school now that their housing situation was stable. Robert had driven down from Chicago with several other elderly individuals who had successfully fought off family members' attempts to control their assets. Dr. Hayes attended, along with several other community members who had supported our programs through donations and volunteer work. As I looked out at this gathering of people who had become my chosen family, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with my biological children or their approval. These were individuals who valued me for my contributions to their community, who respected my judgment and sought my advice, who celebrated my successes without calculating how they might benefit from my achievements. I want to tell you about the most important thing I've learned in these past 2 years, I began, feeling the same calm confidence that had carried me through the courtroom confrontation with my children. I've learned that family is not defined by blood relationships or legal obligations, but by mutual respect, genuine care, and shared commitment to something larger than individual self-interest. The room was quiet as I continued, describing the journey from manipulation and betrayal to independence and purpose. I talked about the months of strategic deception that had been necessary to expose my children's true motivations, the painful legal battle that had validated my competency and my right to make my own decisions, and the gradual process of building a new life based on my own values rather than family expectations. Some of you may think I was too harsh in cutting off my children completely, I acknowledged. Some people in our community certainly felt that way, believing that family relationships should be preserved regardless of how badly family members behave toward each other. But I want you to understand that I didn't abandon my children. They abandoned me the moment they decided I was worth more to them as a source of inheritance than as a person deserving of respect and consideration. I paused, looking around the room at faces that reflected understanding and support rather than judgment or criticism. The choice I made to donate my assets to charitable causes instead of preserving them for ungrateful children was not an act of revenge or spite, though it may have appeared that way to outside observers. It was an act of self-preservation and self-respect, a decision to ensure that the resources Harold and I had worked so hard to accumulate would be used to help people who genuinely needed assistance rather than people who simply wanted financial security they hadn't earned. As I concluded my remarks, I felt a sense of peace that had been elusive during the turbulent months of family conflict and legal battle. The work we had accomplished together, the lives we had touched, the programs we had established represented a form of immortality that was far more meaningful than any inheritance I could have left to my children. The applause that followed my speech was warm and sustained, but more important to me were the individual conversations that continued throughout the evening. Person after person approached me to share their own stories of family disappointment and betrayal, their struggles to maintain independence in the face of pressure from relatives who claimed to know what was best for them, their gratitude for the example I had provided of how to fight back against manipulation and control. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Helen and I found ourselves alone in the foundation office, surrounded by the charts and photographs that documented our program's growth and impact. The quiet satisfaction I felt was unlike anything I had experienced during the years when my primary identity had been defined by my relationships with Harold and our children. "Margaret," Helen said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the comfortable familiarity of our long friendship. "Do you ever regret the choice you made? Do you ever wonder what might have happened if you had tried to work things out with Daniel, Jessica, and Kevin instead of taking such a dramatic stand?" I considered her question carefully, as I had many times during the past 2 years. The honest answer was complicated, involving layers of loss, relief, satisfaction, and ongoing sadness that would probably never completely resolve. "I regret that my children turned out to be the kind of people who could treat their mother the way they treated me," I replied finally. "I regret that they were so focused on money that they couldn't see the value of genuine relationship. I regret that they'll never understand what they lost when they chose inheritance over integrity." I paused, looking out the window at the lights of downtown Riverside, where some of our shelter residents were settling in for the night in safe, warm beds instead of sleeping in cars or on park benches. "But I don't regret the choice I made to protect myself and my assets from their manipulation," I continued. "I don't regret creating programs that have helped hundreds of people improve their lives. And I don't regret discovering that I'm capable of building meaningful relationships with people who value me for who I am, rather than what I can provide them." As Helen and I locked up the office and prepared to return to our respective homes, I realized that this conversation had crystallized something I had been gradually understanding about the difference between regret and grief. I grieved the loss of the relationships I had wanted to have with my children, but I didn't regret the decisions that had led to that loss, because those decisions had been necessary to preserve my dignity and independence. The drive home through the quiet streets of Riverside gave me time to reflect on how completely my life had changed from the days when I had measured my worth by my children's approval and my success by their willingness to include me in their plans. The woman behind the wheel now was someone I barely would have recognized 3 years earlier. Confident, independent, purposeful, and surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her well-being. As I pulled into the driveway of the house on Maple Street, I noticed that the porch light was on, something I had started doing not out of hope that my children might visit, but as a symbol of welcome for the friends and colleagues who had become my chosen family. The house that had once felt empty and purposeless now felt like a sanctuary and a command center for work that gave my life meaning. Before going inside, I took a moment to stand in the garden Harold and I had planted together, breathing in the spring air and listening to the sounds of a neighborhood settling into sleep. The woman who had once felt powerless against her children's schemes now wielded influence that extended far beyond her own family, touching lives and creating opportunities for people who had been written off by others. The transformation was complete, but the story was far from over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to make a difference in the lives of people who needed assistance. New chances to demonstrate that aging didn't have to mean helplessness or dependence on ungrateful family members. New possibilities for building the kind of legacy that would honor Harold's memory and reflect my own values. As I settled into bed in the house that was now truly mine, I felt grateful for the betrayal that had forced me to discover my own strength, for the legal battle that had validated my competency, and for the community that had embraced my contributions, without trying to control or manipulate me. The inheritance my children had lost had been transformed into something far more valuable, a legacy of service that would continue long after I was gone, touching lives and creating opportunities for generations to come. The last thing I saw before falling asleep was Harold's photograph on my nightstand, and I could almost see him smiling with approval at the woman I had become and the choices I had made. The frightened, desperate widow who had once sought validation from ungrateful children had evolved into someone who created her own validation through meaningful work and genuine relationships. It had been a long journey from that humiliating Thanksgiving dinner to this place of peace and purpose, but every step had been worth it. The woman who slept in that house on Maple Street was finally, completely, authentically herself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.